Merci d'être là. Merci d'être présente pour ce lancement du nouveau livre en français d'Erin Wunker, Carnets d'une féministe rabat-joie, essai sur la vie quotidienne. Merci à la librairie Le Guillion de nous accueillir. Merci surtout à Madeleine Stafford, qui n'est pas là ce soir, mais qui est la traductrice, qui a fait la merveilleuse traduction de ce livre et qui l'a fait en y réfléchissant. Je me disais qu'elle avait fait une traduction située. C'est une traduction québécoise pour le public québécois. Et donc, elle a pris en considération un tas d'expressions idiomatiques, un français plus local, on pourrait dire. Et ce qui fait que je trouvais que la traduction située était peut-être une manière de rebondir sur le point de vue situé qui est si important dans ton livre. Le livre d'Erin, avant d'en parler plus directement, est le premier de la collection, donc on inaugure, on pourrait dire. Je lui ai dit qu'elle venait d'effleurer notre collection. C'est la collection Vigilante qui est accueillie par Patrick Poirier et par les Pumes et qui se veut une collection de recherche-création féministe, queer, dans la diversité. Enfin, on ouvre le tout, mais ce qu'on cherche, ce sont des objets qui sont des ovnis, donc des objets uniques qui ne ressemblent pas à des essais scientifiques traditionnels, qui peuvent être issus de gens qui travaillent dans les universités, mais qui écrivent autrement. Et c'est le cas du livre d'Erin qui nous présentait exactement ce qu'on cherchait, je pense, qui avait cette forme fragmentée, autobiographique, et qui en même temps réfléchit à des questions de fond, qui s'inspirent d'écrits philosophiques, etc., comme on aura l'occasion d'en parler. Donc, Erin Wunker, elle est présidente de l'organisme Femmes canadiennes dans les arts littéraires et elle est rédactrice en chef du blog Hook and Eye, Fast Feminism, Slow Academe. C'est pas mal, c'est tout un programme. Elle enseigne en ce moment à Dalhousie, elle a un poste à l'université Dalhousie en Nouvelle-Écosse. Mais ce qui est intéressant, c'est qu'elle a vécu en Caroline du Nord, donc ça fait partie de ce qu'elle raconte dans son livre, où tu as fait ton baccalauréat, en fait ton BA. Ouais. Ensuite en Alberta, enfin à Montréal, où elle avait la maîtrise, et en Alberta, où tu as fait le doctorat. Ouais. Donc, il y a aussi cette idée du voyage ou de ce qui circule dans ton livre. Et il me semblait que c'était intéressant. Est-ce que tu veux commencer par lire un extrait et après on parle, ou tu veux qu'on parle, puis après tu... Et Erin va parler anglais.
Pardon-moi, je parle en anglais parce que c'est trop dur pour tout le monde. Quand j'ai essayé en français, j'ai essayé un petit peu, je comprends beaucoup, mais I'll just really fuck it up if I try to. So I don't want to do that. Maybe I'll read?
Yeah, why not? Give it a sense of the book.
And I think actually I'll read from the very end rather than the section that you're... Okay, bonjour, bonsoir. I was just back. I was in with my family. I was in Barcelona, where I also don't speak the language of Catalan very well, but earnestly try and either endear myself through my earnest attempts or I get a lot of eye rolling. Both are fine, and so I'm not doing very well with words in either language. I just want to say thanks so much for coming. And thank you so much to the press, the presses, the series, to the editors, and to Madeleine who translated this book. It is such an honor to be translated into French, and especially a situated French for Canada and specifically for Quebec. That excites me more than I can say. I wrote part of my PhD on the work of Nicole Brassard and the work of Gail Scott, but translated in English, and so it's such an honor. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. What I want to do, can you hear me okay at the back? What I want to do is just read from the very end. This is a book in fragments, and we'll talk a little bit more about how it was written, but in English it's called Notes, for reasons that I'll talk about maybe later. It had to be written in very quick bursts, short bursts. So what comes at the end is a postscript, a PS, and it's from the middle end of that I want to read. It brings together the sort of the central threads of the collection. Some years ago, I was teaching a Canadian studies class. The Idea of Canada, it was called. The notion that there could be a singular idea troubled me, and I told my students so, breaking down my own privilege for them. How many of you do a double take with me standing at the front of the classroom? I asked them. A few tentative hands. Is it my whiteness? I asked. No. Is it my gender that I look and act and identify as a cisgendered woman? No. Is it my nondescript North American accent? No, not unless I drop a y'all, thus betraying a decade plus of my childhood spent in the southern rural United States. Is it my tattoos? Yes, haha, careful little giggles. What can we make of this, I asked the students, that my whiteness, my heteronormativity, my unaccented English makes me a relatively expected presence at the front of the classroom? Yes, they agreed, yes, there's something to that. Okay, I said, let's unpack these assumptions inscribed on my body. Let's think about power. Let's do that in the context of these lands and ideas called Canada. We spent the fall breaking down what that might mean, moving through pluralities, lands, stories, narratives, nations, histories, oppositions, solidarities. It was one of those classes in a large amphitheater, you know the kind. When you're lecturing in it at the front, you can see everyone in the room, but if you're seated, you feel anonymous. I would like to tell you that every student was riveted. That would be a lie. Instead, there were a few scattered mainly in the front rows who became dependable barometers for me. Lecture going well? M would lean forward in her seat. J would be nodding and writing notes. Lecture off track, not engaging? B would look disappointed. Later in the semester, we started talking about the gatherings, rallies, and demonstrations that were happening across the country. I was teaching in Jibuktuk in Mi'kma'ki, Halifax, Nova Scotia, at Dalhousie University. Several students in my course self-identified as Indigenous. We talked about how the media was narrativizing these rallies as unprecedented, as springing up from land as if from nowhere. The wrong stories were being told about the peoples and the reasons for protests, we decided. The general public was being fed half-truths and misrepresentations, lies. How lucky, I thought, to have these movements happen now as we're in this class together thinking through Canada and ideas about it. Something to shift us, maybe. Something teachable, definitely. The students felt it too, this thing I'm calling luck, some of them more than others. Later, a few course evaluations would say, too much feminism, or I didn't think this was going to be a class about Indigenous issues, or she, meaning me, is too political. The ones who were paying attention to the news, not necessarily to me, worked to articulate some of the energy that they were seeing. What is a round dance? Can I participate? What is Bannock? I was asked these questions after class or in careful apologetic emails. The apologies to me, a white teacher at the front of the classroom, gave me pause. I felt a heaviness in my body, an awareness of my responsibility, and more, of my inadequacy. I can't ever remember not being aware of my own body in the world. Specifically, I mean my own gendered body. Even more specifically, I can't remember a time when I haven't been told or taught or intuited that my worth as a body-gendered female had to do with the space I take up. I started counting calories when I was 11 or 12. This was before the internet, before the circulation of selfies became its own kind of regulatory or freeing tool, depending. One of my friends explained her lack of snack at recess. I'm fat, she said. And I thought, oh, is that something I should worry about too? The girl, my friend, she was more popular than me. I started noticing that my mother was careful. That's what she called it, being careful with food. She would refuse second helpings, a taste of meat from my father's plate, snacks with Murder, She Wrote on Sunday evenings. I can't remember how it came up, but when I asked her about food, she told me that women have to be cautious. She gave me a booklet that told you how many calories were in items of food. I started writing things down. 1,200. That was the magic number. I became good at math, though I was struggling with it in school. It's funny how things change and how they stay the same. The first few days and weeks after we brought our girl home from the hospital, I would write down how long she nursed. In the middle of the night, with this tiny human in my arms, I would type, right side, 3:40 to 4:05 a.m. Left side, 4:20 to 4:45 a.m. in the notes app on my phone. After a week, the midwives came to our house, stripped her down to her diaper, wrapped her in a little cloth sling, and measured her in a hand scale. She looked like she was getting ready for market. 8 pounds, they pronounced. Good. I felt relieved. I stopped logging her nursing quite as obsessively. And then, one day, I stopped logging it entirely. In the fall of 2012, Idle No More gained traction across the country. This was around the end of the semester and the completion of that Canadian Studies class. One day after class had ended, I was completing some grading in my office when I received an email from one of my students. It was M. She was working on a press release for an Idle No More gathering in the city and wanted to know if I would read it over. She was on campus, so I walked over to where she was in the First Nations Students Association. Neither M nor I had ever written a press release, so I put up a plea on social media asking for help. The first person to respond was then Halifax NDP MP Megan Leslie. She sent some examples and some notes. She sent them right away. I need to tell you this and I need you to hear it. Megan Leslie, who neither M nor I have ever met, responded right away. Don't get me started on how this woman has been denigrated for her feminism. Don't get me started on her generosity. Those aren't the same stories, but they, both her and her feminism and her generosity, require labor from her. She helped us immediately because we asked. We circulated the announcement, and later that week I gathered at the first of a series of public meetings about Omnibus Bill C-45. Among other things, C-45, the Jobs and Growth Act, proposed to overhaul the Navigable Waters Protection Act and to extinguish Canada's duty to consult with First Nations when enacting developments that would affect First Nations lands and communities. Lands, bodies, nourishment. That's the whole of what makes us up, isn't it? These are root issues, rooting issues. M's sister and another Mi'kmaq woman were the central organizers of the gatherings that were happening across the city and the province. When Chief Teresa Spence made her journey from Attawapiskat to Ottawa, when she embarked on her hunger strike, while she waited for the former Prime Minister to concede to meet with her, the women here went on a hunger strike in solidarity. At a rally, M's sister invited everyone present to consider joining the Solidarity hunger strike. I thought about what I could do and whether it would mean anything if I, at home, alone, was quietly striking in solidarity. I decided it meant something to join this struggle viscerally with my own body. I told M that I would join as well. 3 days of only water and broth in solidarity with a woman, a chief, sitting across from the Parliament buildings, waiting for the Prime Minister to speak with her. Waiting on behalf of her people, waiting in Ottawa, Algonquin territory, waiting, hungry. What is 3 days of my time, I thought. Me with my unearned white privilege, me with my credentials, me with my cisgender, me with so much and yet here on my students' traditional lands, unrooted from elsewhere. Where? What is 3 days when I can show my solidarity with my student, her sister, her community, her histories? What is 3 days of being hungry? Nothing. 3 days is nothing to give another person.
I told you I was going to ask you to speak about the genesis of this book, how it came about. And then listening to you read, there were two things that kind of stuck out for me. When you talk about the food and you say, I started writing things down. And then, how can I join in solidarity? And I think how do these two elements that you just read in the last part of the book actually speak of the whole project, maybe? If it's a way for you to speak about how this book came about.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. Thank you for it. Choosing to write things down when you're attempting to make a record or an intervention, I think is one thing, and certainly the more positive aspect of what I was trying to do, or what I try to do when I use social media, which I do less these days for reasons that we could talk about or not. But writing this book down in small fragments became a way of sort of documenting and archiving my time when my daughter was very, very young. So I was asked by the English publisher of this book to write a book about feminism for a non-fiction series that they were starting. It was going to be the second collection, and could it just be about feminism? And I classically misunderstood and thought that they wanted me to write a handbook. Here's how to be a feminist. And I thought, sure, I can do that. I'm a teacher. I can do that. What arrogance. I couldn't do that. I didn't know how to do that. And so I gave birth and thought that would get me off the hook from having to complete my contract. Again, what arrogance. And so when the press started gently writing to me and saying, I hope that the baby's doing well, I hope the dog is no longer afraid of the baby, might you send us a word count, or even just some drafts? I realized that I would have to change how I wrote. And so writing happened in stolen pockets of time, often with a small human on me in some way, which physically is extremely uncomfortable and not at all like television would suggest. And so I started writing in very small fragments, drawing, as we were talking about before this, on some of the continental theorists who I love so much, Roland Barthes being one of them, but realizing that fragments can be a form, and that form can do something to gesture towards the moment that you're trying to archive. Yeah.
And that fragments may allow you to think, which is what you show throughout how comment tu fais un montage de ces fragments pour arriver à penser quelque chose.
And the editorial process of Julie Jewston was so wonderful. In order to keep momentum with this, I would write. I would set myself a time. I'm gonna get 2 hours in today. Somewhere in this 24-hour period, I'm gonna write for 2 hours, and so it would happen 15 minutes, 5 minutes, sometimes on my phone in a notes app. Really, again, I guess the theme of tonight is that I had a problem with arrogance. I used to think when people read from their phone, like, oh, what are you doing? And I realized, this is completely utilitarian. This is, you use the tools you have, of course. And then I would amass it into a document and send it to her. And she's a developmental editor, so she would write back in track changes, just asking me questions about what I wrote. So no edits, no sort of take this out, put this in, but she would just sort of be in dialogue with me. And so it became a record of also thinking with another person, or maybe sort of two people, like myself, the text I produced, and then this editor who was a careful reader. I think of Patricia Dunker's amazing novel called Searching for Foucault, and in that she talks about, the main character talks about seeking the ideal reader, and that felt like that sort of dialogue emerged. Yeah.
Before we started, I said to you I had like some words that I had jotted down to sort of have you talk about the book, and one of them that came up was nomadisme.
Yeah.
Comment ça bouge dans ton livre? Comment ça circule?
Yeah, it's I love the way, I like the way that the mind does move, often in failures of translation. You say, how do I bouge? And I think, oh yeah, and being able to move is so much tied up in economy, and I think about being bougie or not bougie, bourgeois or not bourgeois too, right? It's not at all the same thing, but in terms of physically moving in the book, that has been very much tied up in the sort of the long neoliberal moment that we find ourselves in, access to all sorts of things that should, or we're told, Lauren Berlant talks about cruel optimism, that we believe, and we've been taught this narrative that things are all going to be okay, and And so we keep working on a particular track, and in fact, this long moment of late capitalism and neoliberalism is very carefully saying, yeah, you keep doing that, it's not going to be okay. And so I feel like I've always been an outsider in all of the places that I've lived, never quite fitting in, but never being ostracized either, so being able to observe quite a bit. And I think that moving physically has also affected the way that my mind works a bit like a magpie. It's not quite so distracted as to be shiny over there, but there is a sort of I think I've learned it from reading other writers and possibly often writers in translation. I was just dying with the Marguerite Duras buttons that are over there for sale. I think about reading Duras in translation as a teenager in rural North Carolina, thinking like there's a world out there that is so, beyond even what I get from Sassy magazine. And so the kinesthetic thought process also lends it to the fragment. And then of course Rosie Braidotti's brilliant thinking around nomadism as a kind of, she's not, to my reading at least, not glorifying nomadic feminism in any way. This sort of necessity of constantly being on the move, and yet at the same time there is something that comes from a moving, a gathering, being able to understand your ties and your rootedness to place as something that is not requiring you to be in place constantly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
From there, I would ask you about privilege and whiteness, which you read through, like the passage you read. And it's central to your book.
Yeah.
That cette prise de conscience.
Yeah. I don't know if it translates, but in the work that I do, we talk a lot about intersectional feminism. Is it the same? Yeah. And this is, I write about this in the book too. I feel like I came to, it's such a belated story, but such a sort of a classic story. I feel like I came to feminism late. I came to feminism in grad school in a way, even though I'd like to think that I have a much longer history of being a bit of a badass, which to my mind is always inherently in some ways tied to being a feminist. But in many ways my intellectual understanding, partly because I lived in the country and the internet didn't exist, and so I met most of my friends through books. I was a bookish kid. I was a shy kid. I am a shy adult who works really hard to not be shy in front of people. Reading feminist theory from a wide variety of writers cracked open something for me that suddenly made the academic work that I found myself sort of falling into relevant. This is what, trying to think in a porous and yet practical way for changing the world suddenly became really important. And it was, learning or unlearning. And I finished grad school in 2008, right? So, it was, we were reading kind of the classic high theorist, Spivak, unlearning. That was a big word for me. Reading Kristeva's Giving Mother to the Other Woman, where she talks about, where Spivak, in another Spivak piece, where she talks about why French feminism should matter for women in developing nations. And she actually makes this kind of compelling argument for why, she's not talking about intersectionalism at the time, and all of a sudden, I'm interacting with and learning and reading Black feminist thought, and she's like, pow, there's your intersectional analysis, and reckoning with all of the sorts of things that come with unearned privilege is a reckoning with, what it means to have arrived at a place, graduate school, where you're an adult and you have only had to think about certain kinds of, or certain aspects of your identity. So I already knew that being gendered the way that I'm gendered and reading the way that I do came with its own consequences. You know, I understood to a certain degree misogyny and patriarchy. I didn't understand the intersecting ways in which I was complicit in that for other women who don't share my identity, and my lived reality. And so, if you're gonna write a book with the phrase feminist killjoy, which is not my phrase, right? Sarah Ahmed's the person who really coins that phrase. And if you're going to try to talk about feminism I was writing this in 2016, and I'm going to try to talk about feminism in 2016. I mean, it's completely irresponsible not to situate yourself, I think, not to do that work of standpoint epistemology and say, here is where I am, here is what I can do, and I can only ever speak from my own point of view, and recognize that in speaking, perhaps my voice is casting over somebody else's voice. But, so I guess one last thing that I'll say about that is that recognizing the importance of situating your own privilege, but not stopping there, not doing that sort of like, but what can I as a white lady do? That sort of backing up that happens so often, while at the same time recognizing that the academic training that I had done is so useful. I can only speak from my own position, but I know how to research and I know how to cite other people's work, and so citational politics becomes a way of amplifying the work of other people. And so that was it became a way of writing from the training that I had done, but towards other writing that I aspire to and admire.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My last question, and then maybe Valérie can read an excerpt. Is the feminist killjoy a badass? Do they go together?
I mean, I suppose it depends who's asking. Sarah Ahmed, I had this amazing conversation with her. The publisher in English, they go by Book Hug now. For reasons of they're really trying to shift their branding a little bit.
They went from Book Tug to Book Hug?
Yes, I don't know what to say. This is a conversation for another time. It's not my decision. Yeah. Actually, they've been critiqued for taking up the word thug as a white publisher, so they're trying to rebrand is what they're trying to do. It's quite admirable, but I will say and have told them, Book Hug, I think that this is like a placeholder for where they're going. Anyways, I digress. They had wanted this book to be called The Feminist Killjoy Handbook. So anyone with a workable understanding of grammar understands that article "the" suggests that it is the singular thing, and I was hugely uncomfortable with that. And indeed was uncomfortable with having feminist killjoy in the title, even though it's not copyrighted and language circulates in such a way that we steal from people without citing them all the time. But earnestness is my métier, and so I wrote to Sarah Ahmed and said, you don't know me, and I went from there, and we had this wonderful conversation in which ultimately she said, you can do whatever you want. I think there should be the more feminist killjoys who occupy different positionalities in the world, the better. I would say yes, but since you've asked me, I'll ask my publisher, because I have a new book coming out, which just came out last year. It's called Living a Feminist Life, and in that she publishes a manifesto as well as a toolkit, which is effectively a handbook, right? And so her publisher said, since she's asking, let's go with no, don't call it the Feminist Killjoy Handbook, which made me feel hugely relieved. And Ahmed is the one who kind of suggested not this title, but going in this direction. And then she said, with an act of extreme generosity, I'm so sorry, can I make up for it by giving you a blurb? And then I died on the floor. I'm actually just a ghost here now. I've lost my train of thought because I've just gushed about Sarah Ahmed
That's
for so long. I think that in her book she says that the feminist killjoy is so in living a feminist life, the feminist killjoy is a badass, but not necessarily in an inherently cool kind of way. Much more in the wet blanket, rain on the parade, sort of just the cloud that follows people around and is like, no. And part of that toolkit at the end is where she's saying it sucks to say no, bad, don't, stop to others all the time. It's exhausting to live in rape culture, in misogyny, in racism. It's exhausting to be a feminist killjoy. So how do you kind of keep yourself going? I certainly wouldn't consider myself to be a badass. I don't think a badass is like earnestness is badassery redux, but I think that refusal and thinking about making worlds otherwise is inherently badass, yeah.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Tu veux-tu?
Oui, je vais lire. Est-ce que ça va? Ça, comme une page bleue. Moi, c'est ce qui m'avait plu le plus dans le livre aussi, c'était ce rapport-là aux autres autrices, écrivaines, la littérature aussi, le rapport à la lecture, l'amitié au féminin à travers justement les études littéraires, ce truc-là. Je vais lire un passage sur ça. L'urgence de la réflexion vient en partie des portraits souvent négatifs que l'on peint de l'amitié féminine. Dans Bad Féministe, Roxane Gay nous encourage à se départir de l'idée que les relations entre femmes sont forcément hyper toxiques et compétitives. Je suis d'accord, vraiment. Mais ça reste une idée à la mode. Je pense ici à Lina Dunham et aux autres scénaristes de la série Girls qui ont érigé leur empire en répandant des clichés sur la négativité des femmes et leur ambivalence envers leurs semblables. D'accord, la série offre de beaux moments télé, mais en règle générale, elle présente des amitiés féminines reposant essentiellement sur une méchanceté réciproque. Qui profite de cette image? Certainement pas les femmes. Pourtant, quand je songe à celles avec lesquelles j'ai moi-même été en relation dans ma vie, je vois d'où peuvent venir les préjugés négatifs dont il faut se défaire. La dense pression atmosphérique enveloppant les discours sur l'amitié féminine confirme l'absence d'un langage nuancé. Je ne suis pas en train de suggérer que l'amitié entre femmes manque de nuances. J'ai parfois l'impression qu'elle est tout en nuances, mais plutôt que les discours sur le sujet sont trop souvent monolithiques. Récemment, ma prof de yoga écrivait qu'elle s'est longtemps sentie inférieure en compagnie de femmes qu'elle admirait. Fait étonnant, elle racontait même que lorsqu'elle était témoin de leur accomplissement, elle les jalousait ou s'apitoyait sur son sort plutôt que de se réjouir de leur succès. Merci, Anne, d'avoir tenu publiquement ces propos, parce que quand je les ai lus, je m'y suis reconnue, à contre-cœur. Cela ne me procure ni fierté ni satisfaction d'avouer ici, noir sur blanc, qu'il m'arrive, d'éprouver ce genre d'émotion quand c'est pourtant le cas. Alors voici où je veux en venir quand je dis qu'une dense pression atmosphérique enveloppe les discours sur l'amitié féminine. En règle très générale, le patriarcat complique les relations entre femmes. On peint souvent les femmes comme des êtres sournois, mesquins, frivoles. On présente presque toujours des amitiés féminines basées sur la méchanceté et la compétitivité. Dans une culture patriarcale, les femmes se jouent dans le dos pour gagner l'attention des hommes. Et ce n'est là qu'un aperçu du genre de complications qu'engendre le patriarcat. Le problème, c'est qu'on hérite de ces représentations de l'amitié féminine. Celle-ci se perpétue d'office, de génération en génération. C'est comme ça que ça se passe entre femmes. La réception, voire la transmission de ces images, est une forme de destruction et de contrôle patriarcal. Notre rapport avec nous-mêmes, sans parler de ceux que nous entretenons avec nos semblables, procède d'un tâtonnement complexe et souvent étouffant. Nous avançons à l'aveuglette dans une obscurité tantôt réconfortante, tantôt menaçante, aux contours doux ou épineux. Et les discours qui circulent sur les femmes ou les amitiés féminines ne font rien pour éclairer la route. Une des certitudes qui m'habite ces jours-ci est que la féministe rabat-joie n'y arrivera pas seule. Elle a besoin d'amis, d'un réseau de soutien, d'alliés, d'un répit de tous ses efforts pour abattre la joie afin de refaire le monde. Je sais au moins ça. Pourtant, de la même manière que mon moi d'avant, celle qui se pensait trop fine pour être féministe, me fait grincer les dents, J'ai honte d'avouer que j'ai mis si longtemps à comprendre pourquoi la rabat-joie a tant besoin d'amis. On sait que l'amitié féminine existe, sous une infinité de formes impossibles à contenir dans un seul essai. Alors pourquoi est-ce qu'on s'évertue à en faire des représentations si réductrices, quitte à rendre l'amitié carrément invisible ou à la dépouiller de tout potentiel de radicalisation, jusqu'à ce qu'elle ne soit plus que l'ombre d'elle-même? À quoi ressemblerait un mode de vie axé sur l'amitié féminine?
J'ai envie qu'on s'arrête là-dessus. Il me semble que ça, c'est parfait. Que ce que tu dis sur la radicalité de l'amitié féminine, c'est au centre du livre et c'est peut-être au centre de la collection qu'on dirige. Voilà. Merci d'avoir accepté de publier avec nous.
Oh my God, merci à vous.
Avez-vous des questions?
No pressure.
Non. Buvons.
Merci.